The delivery guy who used to be a racer. Jake's days at Tony's Pizza were predictable, almost ritualistic. He'd arrive at the shop just before the lunch rush, grab his red cap, and nod at Tony, who was always in the back, kneading dough with hands that seemed to know the recipe by heart. The shop itself was a relic of the past. Faded, checkered tiles, a jukebox that only played half the songs, and the faint hum of a neon sign that flickered like a heartbeat. Jake liked the predictability. It was a far cry from the chaos of his old life. He'd spend his shifts weaving through the streets of the neighborhood, delivering pizzas to regulars who knew him by name, but never asked questions. To them, he was just Jake, the quiet delivery guy with the beat-up Honda. They didn't know about the trophies gathering dust in a storage unit across town or the scars, both physical and emotional, that he carried from his racing days. Jake preferred it that way. The less people knew, the easier it was to keep the past buried. But the past has a way of resurfacing, especially when you least expect it. Jake's racing career had been meteoric. By the time he was 25, he was one of the most promising drivers in the amateur circuit. His natural talent, combined with his brother David's mechanical expertise, made him a force to be reckoned with. Sponsors lined up to back him, and fans cheered his name at every race. But it all came crashing down one fateful night. Ryan, Jake's closest friend and teammate, had always been the more cautious of the two. But Jake had a way of pushing people, of convincing them to take risks they wouldn't normally take. That night, during a qualifying race, Jake egged Ryan on, telling him to shave off a few milliseconds by taking a tighter line. Ryan hesitated, but eventually gave in. It was a decision that cost him his life. The crash was brutal. Ryan's car spun out of control at over 120 miles per hour, slamming into the barrier and erupting into flames. Jake was the first to reach the wreckage, but it was too late. The guilt was suffocating. He replayed the moment over and over in his mind, wondering if he could have done something differently. In the end, he walked away from racing, leaving behind the only life he'd ever known. It was a Friday night when everything changed. Jake was sitting in his Honda outside Tony's, waiting for his next delivery, when he saw Mr. Vasquez's SUV being stolen. The old man's panicked cries stirred something in Jake, a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. Without thinking, he took off after the thieves. What followed was a high-speed chase through the city streets, with Jake's Honda weaving through traffic like a predator closing in on its prey. The thieves were skilled, but Jake was in a league of his own. Every turn, every maneuver was executed with precision, as if the years he'd spent away from racing had never happened. When the SUV finally crashed into a lamppost, Jake pulled over and watched as the thieves stumbled out, dazed and defeated. The cops arrived soon after, and Jake slipped away before anyone could ask questions. But the chase had awakened something in him, a part of himself he thought he'd left behind. Word of the chase spread quickly through the neighborhood. People who had once seen Jake as just another face in the crowd now looked at him with a mix of awe and curiosity. Tony, ever the opportunist, offered Jake a partnership in the pizza shop, seeing the potential for a marketing boost. But Jake wasn't sure if he wanted to stay in the quiet life he'd built for himself. Around the same time, a local racing team reached out to him. They'd heard about the chase and wanted him to train their next generation of drivers. It was an opportunity to reconnect with his past, but on his own terms. Jake was torn. The thought of getting back behind the wheel was both exhilarating and terrifying. Could he face the memories that came with it? Could he forgive himself for what had happened to Ryan? In the end, Jake decided to take the job with the racing team. It wasn't an easy decision, but he knew he couldn't keep running from his past. He started small, teaching young drivers the basics of racing and emphasizing the importance of safety and discipline. It was a way to honor Ryan's memory and ensure that no one else would suffer the same fate. As for Tony's Pizza, Jake kept his ties to the shop, helping out on weekends and staying connected to the neighborhood that had given him a second chance. He still drove the beat-up Honda, though now it was more of a reminder than a necessity. The car had been with him through it all, the highs, the lows, and everything in between. Jake's life was no longer defined by the trophies he'd won or the mistakes he'd made. It was a work in progress, a balance between the man he used to be and the man he was becoming. And for the first time in a long time, he was okay with that. The neighborhood, too, began to change. Tony's Pizza saw a surge in business, with people coming in not just for the food, but to catch a glimpse of the man who had become something of a local legend. Jake, however, remained as unassuming as ever. He'd nod at the regulars, crack a rare smile for the kids who idolized him, and continue his deliveries with the same quiet efficiency. But there was a new lightness to him, a sense that he had finally made peace with his past. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the streets were bathed in a warm, golden light, Jake found himself back at Tony's, leaning against the counter with a slice of pizza in hand. Tony clapped him on the back, a proud grin on his face. "You did good, kid," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Jake simply nodded, his gaze drifting to the window where his Honda sat parked, its engine still humming faintly from the day's deliveries. It wasn't much to look at, but it had carried him through some of the toughest moments of his life. And now, it was a symbol of where he'd been and where he was going. As the night wore on and the shop emptied out, Jake stepped outside, the cool evening air brushing against his face. He looked up at the stars, their faint light piercing through the city's glow. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of hope. The road ahead was uncertain, but he was ready to face it, one turn at a time.